Thank you for your patience. We need one more member to get started, and then we'll have a quorum, so a couple more minutes. The Subcommittee on Interior, Energy, and Environment will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. I'd like to thank everyone for being here, and especially thank you for your patience in us having to run off and do some other business. But we're here, and I appreciate your travels. I'll begin with my opening statement. Good afternoon. The Subcommittee on Interior, Energy, and Environment is meeting today to examine difficulties ranchers with federal grazing permits face, as well as to discuss recommendations to improve cooperation between permittees and our federal land management agencies. Access to public lands is critical for many people, including hikers, hunters, and fishermen. Today, though, we're here to specifically discuss livestock grazing on federal land. As the Western Governors Association says, ranchers are, quote, an important contributor to the customs, cultures, and rural economies of the West, end quote. The Public Lands Council estimates that grazing on federal land contributes at least $1.5 billion to the economy and supports thousands of jobs. In fiscal year 2017, livestock producers held almost 18,000 grazing permits on BLM land and nearly 6,000 active permits on Forest Service land. These operators rely on access to public lands to produce food, wool, and even clothing, as my friend John Helly will be able to discuss later in his testimony. Those are a few of the obvious benefits of responsible utilization of federal land. Both the BLM and Forest Service are charged with managing federal land for multiple use and sustained yield. Ranching, a business that necessitates careful stewardship of natural resources, complements a number of those other uses. Ranchers partner with the state's wildlife agencies, sportsmen's organizations, and conservation groups to facilitate multiple use. Identifying opportunities to promote cooperation on federal land will be an important part of our discussion today. To add additional perspective on this issue, without objection, I'll enter into enter a statement from Gray Thornton, President and CEO of the Wild Sheep Foundation, into the hearing record. I'd like to thank Mr. Thornton for being here today in the audience and the Wild Sheep Foundation for their contribution to our conversation today. Unfortunately, one of the greatest challenges to grazing is special interest litigation and the abuse of some of our core federal environmental protection statutes. While Congress enacted these laws with good intentions, groups that are determined to drive ranchers off the federal land have transformed them into tools to push certain uses over others. This is not what Congress intended, and it certainly does not support the agency's multiple-use missions. Seeking workable solutions and finding common ground becomes that much more difficult when some special interests fundamentally oppose grazing and routinely turn to litigation instead of collaboration. Not only does the constant threat of litigation distract the BLM and Forest Service from their important missions and drain federal resources, but it results in land management decisions driven by fear and apprehension of the next wave of lawsuits. This is no way to manage our rangelands. I know our witnesses today will help further the conversation about preserving opportunities for grazing while ensuring adequate protection of our rangeland and, above all, true multiple-use management. Part of the solution is to ensure our federal grazing permit programs are fair, provide for meaningful permittee participation, and minimize uncertainty and delays. Producers struggle to defend their operations from seemingly endless attacks by well-funded activist organizations who enjoy incentives to litigate under current law. If the BLM and Forest Service continue to operate at the mercy of special interest litigation and ranchers continue to face unnecessary livestock reductions, many ranchers may decide that they can no longer afford to graze on federal land and will be forced to walk away from their business. This would have devastating consequences for local economies and our ranching families who hope to pass their way of life on to the next generation. The bottom line is that we need rangeland management that utilizes sound science, provides for flexibility, and incorporates permittee input. Livestock producers whose livelihoods depend on understanding the local ecosystem develop specialized knowledge through years, and sometimes decades, of on-the-ground experience in cutting them out of the land management process wastes unique expertise and jeopardizes rangeland health. BLM and Forest Service policies should encourage employees to develop productive working relationships with the producers rather than default to restricting access or trying to shield themselves from litigation. Thank you again for our witnesses for joining us today. I look forward to hearing your testimony on such an important topic. I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Plaskett, for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all of the witnesses and others who are here for this hearing this afternoon. The federal government owns approximately 640 million acres of land in the United States. Most of that land is located in the western states, but not all of it. In my own district, we have the beautifully preserved Virgin Islands National Park, which testifies to the important role the federal government can play in managing lands for the enjoyment of all people of this great country. Today, we'll hear from local ranchers as well as local producers who benefit from permits to graze livestock on federal lands. I am aware and sensitive to the generational land rights of those individuals and the need for the federal government to balance the interests of grazing with the rights of individuals to be able to go onto lands which they've had deeded to them for many years. I understand this. This is something that we are fighting in as a conflict in the Virgin Islands as well, with those individuals who feel that the federal lands are coming to encroach and become big brother on the land that they've used for many generations for their own livelihood. Those viewpoints are important, but there are also other viewpoints that I'm glad that this committee is going to hear from today as well. We'll also hear the viewpoint of the Nez Perce Tribe, whose members are throughout the western United States, in central Idaho, parts of Washington, Oregon, and Montana. Chairman Wheeler, who's here, has stated in his written testimony that the Bighorn sheep are culturally critical to that tribe's existence. The tribe has hunted the bighorn sheep to craft culturally significant items like bighorn bows and have used this wild sheep for food and for clothing. They are so significant to the tribe that the tribe's cultural right to hunt and use the sheep is protected by treaty. The bighorn sheep and the Nez Perce Tribe's critical relationship with this important species and is an example of how federal government agencies must balance commercial interests with cultural and environmental interests and treaty obligations when they manage federal lands. This subcommittee has to balance the needs of many interests and must show the same concern for cultural and environmental interests and treaty obligations as we have for the commercial interests. I hope that our goal with this hearing regarding grazing on Western lands is the same, to support and advance the appropriate and sustainable use of federal lands. I echo the chairman's sentiment that we must bring good science, good economics, sensitivity to cultural needs, as well as historic importance of the lands. As Chairman Wheeler has stated, and I quote, "The Nez Perce Tribe considers recovery of the bighorn sheep population to huntable, healthy, and sustainable levels within our homeland and throughout their suitable historic habitat to be a top resource management priority. Our collective actions have the power to help or hinder this recovery." Indeed, I understand this and share that sentiment for all of our testifiers today. A focus on commercial interests to the exclusion of cultural and environmental equities and treaty obligations, and vice versa, will hinder the recovery not only of bighorn sheep, but the way of life of those that live in the West. I urge this subcommittee to consider Chairman Wheeler's testimony by the ways that the federal government can protect the environment and tribal culture as we examine different opportunities for grazing on public land. And I agree that we must collectively and be collaborative in that effort. While an attorney, I don't prefer litigation and hope that we can resolve our differences in a way that's amicable to the interests of all. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, and thank you. I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses at this time. Mr. John Helly, partner of Helly Livestock. Mr. Scott Horngren, staff attorney and adjunct professor at Western Resources Legal Center. Chairman Shannon Wheeler, chairman of the Nez Perce Tribe. And Mr. Dave Eliason, president of the Public Lands Council. Welcome to all of you. I know you traveled to be here, and we appreciate your testimony. Look forward to your testimony today. Pursuant to the committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before you testify. If you would, please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Please, you may now be seated. In order to allow time for our discussion today, we're going to ask that you each limit your comments to 5 minutes. There is a set of lights and things that'll keep you on time there. As a reminder, that clock will tick down. It turns yellow when you have 30 seconds left and red when your time is up. And then we'll move to our time of questioning. Also, remember the microphones do not work automatically. You have to turn them on before you speak. So with that, we'll start with Mr. Helly. You have 5 minutes.
Chairman Gianforte, Ranking Member Plaskett, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to visit with you today. I am John Helly, a third-generation sheep and wool producer from Dillon, Montana. I am here today to represent the nation's 88,000 sheep producers and those that spend some time on federal grazing lands. Over the years, we have expanded and diversified our ranching operation, preserving open space and adding economic value to our nation. Through the brand Duckworth, we have taken Helly wool from sheep to shelf, all in the United States. We're proud to be able to convert a renewable resource into food and fiber while stewarding the land we run on. Since I was a kid, we've lost over 100,000 sheep in southwest Montana because of the effects of misguided policy enforcement. In fact, Dillon was at one point the world's largest shipping point for wool. Livestock grazing promotes new growth and enhances habitat for wildlife species like sage grouse. Our private land serves as the commensurate base for our federal grazing permits, thus benefiting the public with a quasi-conservation easement on that well-stewarded land. However, family ranching faces a number of challenges that threaten the future of rangeland management west-wide. We have personally witnessed abuse of federal law as our Forest Service allotments were targeted for legal action. Preceding the introduction of bighorn sheep into southwest Montana, our state wildlife agency and local interests, including us landowners, came together outlining a workable plan forward. Our ranch, along with others—
Excuse me, Mr. Helly, if you could just straighten your microphone, we'll get a better recording and we can all hear you. Thank you.
Sorry. Our ranch, along with others, entered into an MOU detailing the obligation to preserve domestic grazing and support wildlife populations. Under state statute, the department assured ranchers, such as myself, that the introduction of this species into areas where domestic livestock were present would not result in any harm to our ranching operation. This promise has proven to be false. In the end, our reward for working cooperatively with these agencies to introduce a bighorn sheep herd was 3 years of costly litigation. The consequence of losing here could be the loss of permits we've grazed for generations. Earlier this month, my attorney had to appear before a 3-judge panel in the Ninth Circuit over an appeal on the 4th denial from the district court of an injunction on my grazing permit. This case arose from the same fact pattern earlier referenced on bighorn sheep habitat under the Forest Management Plan. Laws like EJA encourage the propagation of litigation and excess legal filings. Thankfully, the Ninth Circuit denied their attempt, but my legal fees continue to accrue. Using this flawed logic and claims that only domestic sheep carry specific pathogens, groups have pushed for effective separation between domestic sheep and bighorn sheep. This separation formed the basis for grazing policies like BLM 1730 and species viability claims under the National Forest Management Act. These recommendations were developed without input from the domestic sheep industry or the U.S. Department of Agriculture Ag Research Service. Thanks to USDA research, we now know the pathogen blamed for these deaths in wildlife is found not only in domestic sheep, but other wildlife species as well, and are endemic in bighorn herds across our state. The presence of these pathogens is not indicative of overall bighorn herds' health, yet this continues to be the basis for closing active sheep allotments across the West and reducing sheep AUMs. Using these tactics to threats of litigation based on flawed Forest Service and BLM policy, artificial environmental groups offer federal sheep allotment holders so-called buyout agreements and then tout acceptance as a voluntary action. Citing threats of litigation and loss of livelihood to compel a sale is not voluntary, it's extortive. Due to these practices, it is impossible to accurately assess the number of AUMs our industry has lost. However, together with our ranching neighbors and conservation groups, we formed an alliance to find shared values and common goals. Stewardship on the ranches in our area have demonstrated that we hold the key to successfully achieving the goals of the conservation community by protecting open space and wildlife corridors. Range science and land management is not about setting and adhering to strict standards. These tactics are ineffective unless we start thinking on a landscape scale. Unfortunately, land stewardship is not driving management, rather decisions are based on the fear of litigation. Methods that promote stewardship are the key to preservation of sustainable federal lands management, and wildlife management is a state, not a federal issue. These decisions must be made at the local level with input from local stakeholders, and NEPA must be streamlined to serve its originally intended purpose without spurring litigation. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Helly. At this time, I'd like to recognize Mr. Horngren for your statement.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Plaskett and members of the committee. I'm Scott Horngren, an attorney with the Western Resources Legal Center that provides real-world experience for students interested in supporting resource uses such as livestock grazing. We provide this practical education at Lewis and Clark Law School in Oregon, where I'm an adjunct professor. However, my testimony today doesn't represent the position of the law school. I will discuss ways agencies can improve the cooperative working relationship with grazing permittees by streamlining the cumbersome agency procedures for renewal of grazing permits and eliminating the annual vulnerability of the grazing program to serial litigation. But first, I'll start with a great example of cooperative working relationships between grazing permittees and federal agencies on the nation's only sheep experiment station. Unfortunately, litigation disrupts that cooperative relationship and halts needed research to improve the health of sheep, both bighorn and domestic, and the health of rangeland. One important experiment station project involves how different variables affect transmission of pneumonia between domestic and bighorn sheep. The Western Watersheds Project, whose goal is to halt all public lands grazing, filed numerous lawsuits to halt sheep grazing in areas long used for research since 1924. In the most recent lawsuit, the Forest Service argued that based on a prior settlement with Western Watersheds, grazing could continue and the research should be completed. But the court disagreed and enjoined grazing and completion of the 5-year research project, which was in its final year. The American Sheep Industries Association moved to intervene, given the wide application and benefit of the research to sheep producers. The court deferred ruling on the motion to intervene until after settlement discussions between Western Watersheds and the Forest Service. Last month, the Forest Service settled the case. It agreed to stop domestic sheep grazing on the allotments until further analysis under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. But it didn't include any commitment or deadline to conduct the analysis, and it agreed to pay $80,000 in attorney's fees to the plaintiffs. So Western Watersheds halted the very research designed to promote multiple use and inform how range conditions and other factors can influence disease transmission among the domestic and bighorn sheep. But there's no commitment by the Forest Service to complete the NEPA analysis. Another concern is that the process to renew 10-year grazing permits for ongoing grazing should be straightforward and meaningfully and timely involve the permittees like Mr. Helly. Most grazing allotments have been sustainably grazed by ranching families for half a century or longer. Congress should enact legislation that allows the Forest Service and BLM to renew grazing permits if the rangeland is in satisfactory condition, using a more timely and less expensive categorical exclusion under NEPA rather than a lengthy and expensive EIS. Consultation between agencies about the effect of grazing on species listed under the Endangered Species Act is also disrupting grazing and undermines the cooperative relationship between agencies and permittees. Often the permittee is only given a few days before the grazing season begins to review the draft biological opinion, which has been delayed for half a year or longer. Agencies should be directed to stop forcing permittees into the Hobson's choice between whether to delay turnout to meaningfully review this opinion or instead accept the opinion's overly restrictive conditions in order to turn the livestock out for the season. And then after the ESA consultation is done, the lawsuits come, bringing further delay. Finally, once a 10-year permit is renewed, the grazing's yearly grazing instructions that merely confirm the level of livestock use for particular pastures based on the annual variation in the forage and range conditions are also subject to litigation and should not be. The Ninth Circuit held that these annual operating instructions, or AOIs, are a new final agency action subject to litigation. A dissenting judge in that case argued that, quote, in pragmatic terms, if every AOI for every permit in every allotment every year is open to litigation, it is a little difficult to see how the grazing program can continue. If the purpose of the program is to feed animals, they need to eat now rather than at the end of some lengthy court process. Environmentalists should not have multiple bites at the litigation apple. Congress or the agency should clarify that these final agency actions do not include the annual instructions in the AOIs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Horngren. At this time, I'll recognize Chairman Wheeler for your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and subcommittee members. Tots Kalawit, Oikala Himiuma, Enam Winik, Wasti Toka Dimpt, Wea Weoktpu. My name is Shannon Wheeler. I'm with the Nez Perce Tribe. My people, the Nimi-Poo, or the Nez Perce, have lived in what now central Idaho and parts of Washington, Oregon, and Montana for thousands of years. Thousands of us live there today. We continue to exercise our sovereign treaty-reserved rights to fish, hunt, gather, and pasture our livestock across our broad Aboriginal territory, which today primarily consists of our federal public lands. These lands are critically important to the Nez Perce people as it defines our culture, traditions of thousands of years, and is memorialized in countless ways, including our Treaty of 1855 with the United States government, and that's 12 Stat 957 with the United States. And the current names of the Nez Perce, Clearwater, and Wallowa-Whitman National Forests are part of that to memorialize that. The manner in which these lands are managed are vital to the Nez Perce culture. Public land grazing is a complex and controversial topic. Our tribal members continue to exercise their treaty-reserved rights to pasture livestock on public lands within the Nez Perce homeland, which at one time was around 17 million acres. That was our usual and custom areas, and we ceded over 13 million acres of reservation. We recognize that livestock grazing, when administered responsibly, can be an appropriate and sustainable use of lands. For us, such activity can be an important expression of our history, our wealth, and our culture. We also understand that in some areas and in some circumstances, livestock grazing is not appropriate. We have witnessed, as many members of the committee have, cases in which livestock grazing has been conducted irresponsibly or in areas where the presence of livestock compromises other uses. These areas often provide critical habitat for our treaty-reserved resources. Therefore, rights of the tribe like the Nez Perce, livestock grazing, when authorized or conducted inappropriately, can compromise the exercise of our treaty rights that were reserved for us. One prime example of this is the Rocky Mountain Bighorn sheep, conflicts associated with domestic sheep grazing. As in many areas across the United States, the Nez Perce homeland once supported vast herds of bighorn sheep throughout a network of canyons and subalpine ridges. These animals were materially and culturally critical to the Nez Perce, as was stated before, for bows, and for the under armor of the day was their hide that we used. It was flexible and strong, and we being agile with that in at that time of that period. So to think about that resource itself, the animal itself that cannot speak for itself, but it does speak for itself, but sometimes we don't listen. The animal, when he starts disappearing, and he's not able to tell you what's going on with him, but we recognize that the depletion of the herds we're here to speak for that animal today, and that's why I'm here. And today, these canyon lands and ridges remain in relatively healthy conditions and suitable for bighorn sheep, yet bighorn sheep have been greatly depleted across the vast portions of our homeland. Pneumonia caused by pathogens introduced by the region by domestic sheep has been identified by most scientists as the primary factor contributing to the significant decline and, in many cases, extirpation of numerous native bighorn sheep populations in the American West. At the time of European settlement in the West, the bighorn sheep populations numbered in the tens of thousands within our homeland. These animals now exist in small isolated populations. Pneumonia continues to be the culprit that suppresses these remnant populations. Unfortunately, this situation is common across much of the western U.S., and transmissions of the pneumonia-causing pathogens from domestic bighorn sheep remains the primary concerns of bighorn sheep managers. The bottom line is bighorn sheep cannot share the range with domestic sheep. The Nez Perce Tribe considers recovery of the bighorn sheep populations to huntable, healthy, and sustainable levels within our homeland and throughout their suitable historic habitat to be top resource management priority through recent science-based research. A tool has been developed known as a risk contact model. This tool embraced by the U.S. Forest Service provides land managers with a science-based foundation of evaluating grazing proposals and alternatives. The Nez Perce Tribe recommends that this committee encourage federal agencies to continue using the risk of contact model for evaluating domestic sheep grazing activities within our homeland. And some of this is all written testimony, even though I'm not able to complete this. I would like to say this, and last and least, proposals to transfer these public lands to state and private entities threaten access to and exercise of treaty reserved rights and the resources on which they depend. The Nez Perce Tribe has been and remains categorically opposed to all such proposal. It is my hope that the perspective of the original inhabitants of these lands and the rights of resources reserved by the treaty with the United States are appropriately considered and prioritized. Under Article 6, Clause 3 of the Constitution, the supremacy law, where treaties are the supreme law of the land, and 12 Stat 957, the treaty with the Nez Perces are a piece of that. So I thank you for your time.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman Wheeler, your entire testimony will be read into the record, so we'll have that there. Okay. So thank you for your comments. Mr. Eliason?
Thank you, Chairman Giaforte. Oh, excuse me. Chairman Giaforte, thank you, and Ranking Member Plaskett and members of the subcommittee, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Dave Elison. I'm a fourth-generation rancher from Tremont, Utah. Currently, I serve as president of the National Public Lands. My testimony today is on behalf of 22,000 cattle and sheep producers throughout the West who rely on federal grazing permits. Like many Western ranch families, mine goes back generations on the same land in Box Elder County, Utah. Since 1889, we've stewarded both our private ground and federal land mixed in with it, as if it were our own. Not only does our family rely on the health of these lands, so does our entire community. Staying in business for over 130 years has meant considerable change to our family operation. That means changing our herd to keep up with the times, acquiring new forage and water in dry years, or implementing value-added programs to market our animals. Unfortunately, federal land management policies has often failed to adapt with us. No matter the issue, whether it's sage grouse, feral horses, or bighorn sheep, common sense decisions are all too often set aside. This is out of the proven fear that radical environmental groups will sue to stop even basic conservation practice from moving forward. My family has been the target of at least 2 of these lawsuits. Once filed, the agencies hit the brakes and rushed to appease the litigants. It's a sad, predictable pattern, and I wish I could say our story was unique, but it's not. It's the same story everywhere I travel as president of Public Lands. Another favorite weapon of these litigants is the Endangered Species Act. In fact, of the 145 active petitions for listing, 46% come from 3 groups: Center for Biological Diversity, Defenders of Wildlife, and Wild Earth Guardians. Ironically, these same groups will likely sue to impede recovery, leading to the ESA's poor success rate of only 2%. Fortunately, solutions are being discussed as we speak. Senator Barrasso has introduced legislation based on bipartisan Western Government Association ESA policy resolution. PLC strongly supports this. With many solutions held in hostage in a legal black hole, wildfire and frequent predictable is the predictable outcome of this pattern. The National Interagency Fire Center estimates fuel treatment costs of the agency as at least $150 an acre. Ranchers perform that service at no cost to the taxpayers, and everybody wins: ranchers, wildlife, sportsmen, and even the resource. Instead of embracing this tool, the agencies also often reduce AUMs, eliminate grazing, and just to appease the litigants. A prime example of this is the recent Martin fire in Nevada, which consumed nearly 500,000 acres. 99% of that greater sage-grouse habitat and 82% was priority habitat. That's the best of the best. Unfortunately, due to priority habitat management area designation, and despite clear science that says grazing is compatible and necessary to conserve sage-grouse, the area has not been grazed for at least 2 years. The resulting fuel load of over 2 tons per acre led to the devastating fire that could easily been avoided. Responsible management of those resources, rather than the fear of litigation, should have helped lessen the impact of this fire and many more like it. Streamlining NEPA and enhancing the use of category exclusion is essential to fixing this broken system. So is modernizing the ESA. Enhancing local input and leveraging boots-on-the-ground knowledge will dramatically improve outcomes for the species and shift the focus away from listing and back to recovery where it belongs. No matter the law, we must eliminate unnecessary opportunities for litigation by giving agency personnel the tools they need to use common sense and work with the critical partners. In closing, Mr. Chairman, ranchers stand ready to address the most pressing challenges facing our public lands. From conservation of the greater sage grouse to preventing and fighting wildfires, ranchers want to be the partners on the ground. Further, federal land managers in the West need ranchers to help manage properly. So why not let us help you preserving our public lands for generations to come? Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to the committee for the panel for your testimony. We'll now move to our questions, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes to start. I want to start with this question of compatibility of grazing and multiple use. Can they coexist? Mr. Helly and Mr. Elison, is that correct? We've discussed, BLM and Forest Service both have in their missions the statement, directive for multiple use and sustained yield. Can you describe how grazing is conducive to multiple use on federal land and really try and answer the question, can it coexist with other uses? Mr. Helly first.
Thank you, Mr. Gianforte. Multiple use has been demonstrated on our forest for generations. We've got excellent hunting opportunities, there's recreation opportunities, and by working with conservation groups and like the Montana chapter of Wild Sheep Foundation, we were able to sit down and work out ways that now the Gravelly Range has a huntable population of bighorn sheep and our domestic sheep on there. But it took, grassroots work at the local level and to build trust within these organizations to have that come through. And then when we sign an MOU, and that's a contractual agreement with the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, us, and the Forest Service, the land management agencies, to have that not adhered to or that trust not there.
So having grazing on federal land does not preclude other uses, including wild sheep populations?
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Elison?
Yeah, we're a great believer in multiple use. I mean, we promote, we distribute water, we help maintain the resources as much as we can. It's been proven many times that sheep, cattle, and wildlife mix, and they're a good combination. The worst thing we want is just to try to manage things for a single species. The best we can do is multiple use so the whole country can enjoy these lands.
Yeah. Mr. Helly, just to go back to that I'm really curious about how you've resolved potential conflicts and how have you facilitated these discussions to achieve what you've done in the Gravellys?
Well, we formed a strategic alliance in the Ruby Valley to get together interests from conservation groups like the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, Wildlife Conservation Society, Nature Conservancy, and us landowners and permittee holders have come together to find where we have shared values, and we found that we have very similar goals in the end to preserve that open space and that our commensurate-based property, the land that we use when we're not on the forest, is actually a huge public benefit that the public is receiving by having us have federal grazing leases. So they've realized that that's the key, and that's the network that holds these open spaces and wildlife corridors and all that we enjoy about Southwest Montana. I'm speaking more because of but I'm sure that's true, across the country. There's 130 million acres of private lands that are tied to federal grazing land permit holders. So in combining that with the 250 million acres of land that we graze on the federal leases, that's 400,000 acres of land protected by family ranchers who are very good stewards of the land.
So in your experience, various groups, conservation, ag producers can work together and resolve issues at a local level?
Definitely. We find that we have a lot of shared values and a lot of similar goals.
Okay. Mr. Horngren, you discussed in your testimony some of the ways which federal grazing programs are vulnerable to litigation. Does bad faith special interest litigation pose a threat to multiple use?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. And as an example, one of the plaintiffs in the sheep station case, which is designed to get information on this conflict or perceived conflict between domestic and bighorn sheep, Western Watersheds Project over the years has filed 170 lawsuits over ranching and other multiple use activities on the federal lands.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to recognize the ranking member for her questions, and we'll probably do a couple of rounds here.
Okay, good afternoon. I wanted to ask a question. In our discussion today, we talked about the federal, really central to all of this is the federal government's role in managing federal lands. Currently, the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service play an important role in overseeing grazing. Mr. Hella and Mr. Ellison, do you believe that there should be more or less federal regulation and oversight of commercial grazing on federal lands? Who wants to go first?
Thank you, Ms. Plask. Federal oversight, is important. Those are public lands, but local input on local decisions would help manage those lands more appropriately. We are the experts that live on those lands and have those grazing permits, and sometimes it seems like they try and make decisions without our input. But, I think that, grazing lands are a dynamic system, and they're very localized, and they're different for each region. So offering regulation that is a blanket approach across many states and many different ecosystems may not be appropriate for more site-specific decisions that need to be made on the ground with the experts that the ranching community and the land managers have.
Mr. Ellison?
Yeah, in a simple word, I don't think we need any more rules and regulations. But generally speaking, the ranchers and the forest and BLM get along good. Sometimes there are conflicts by these litigations, throws kind of a monkey wrench into things. But it's important that we do follow the rules and regulations. We're a law-abiding people. We've been in generations on these ranches. We understand that if we take care of the land will take care of us. Important rules and regulations are necessary in our society, but sometimes we can be over-regulated. And I agree with Mr. Helly on the fact that we need local input. It's hard to manage things, say, in Washington D.C. back in Montana or Utah. So local input is very, very important. That I think that people understand the local needs. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Chairman Wheeler, the same question to you. Do you believe that there should be more or less federal regulations and oversight of commercial grazing on federal lands?
Thank you for the question. I definitely believe that the federal government has a trust responsibility to the Treaty of 1855 with the Nez Perce. The question that you ask for local input, I would know that we are on that landscape, so our input definitely is valuable to that decision-making process.
Do you believe that the tribe should be involved in any changes to federal regulations and policy related to this?
I think the ruling on it would be that the was reserved for us, and the resources that were on that landscape is our biggest concern. Is that is our ruling. Our ruling is already in place, and our decision has been made for us over 140 years ago that these animals, this habitat, the fish, that was all reserved in the Treaty of 1855, and our people haven't changed that much from that time. And so our input is that responsibility of the federal government to hold that in trust for us. And I believe that I guess that what you're asking then for this piece would be that our input is here, it's now, and that's what we're here to do.
And do you think that the federal government has managed that properly? The interest of the tribe along with the interest of other commercial interests which may appear to be at odds with one another?
You know, I think that we've had a working relationship with the Forest Service, the USDA, that you know, now they're starting to hear a little more of our concerns of how grazing is affecting the landscape out there. For example, if I may give an example, for one of our Camas areas where we dig roots out there, we don't only graze out there or hunt, but we gather out there, and the livestock is going out into that, and there's no quarantine time for these animals before they get out to the rangeland or out to the Forest Service land. That, you know, maybe at one time they were driven like a cattle drive, but now they're shipped out there. So wherever they was grazing, they're still packing those seeds of noxious weeds out to these lands where we gather. And I think that aspect of it needs to be observed from a tribal standpoint of how that's reflecting on our resources that are out there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So federal grazing permittees are required to have an adjoining base property, and many ranchers operate on a combination of deeded land and then federal land that has a grazing allotment on it. The value of the base property is in part depending on grazing access to the adjoining federal land. Therefore, when the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service reduces AUMs on the grazing allotment, they're also reducing the value of the deeded land. Mr. Ellison, in your written testimony, you describe the current ranch unit, as you refer to it, with deeded base property and attached federal grazing permits. Could you please elaborate on how the private base property and the federal grazing allotments are related and just how the system works?
Sure, glad to. Generally, most of the ranchers have base property. Usually the animals will spend their winters on private property, and then in the summertime they'll go up onto the federal forest and BLM ground. And so it's really quite a combination. If you were to reduce say the grazing on the Forest Service, that means that they can't carry. They have no place to go for those cattle. Most of these ranchers are appraised by the number of animals that they can carry year round. So if you cut the one side, you know, then it reduces the value of the ranch. And as you may know very well, that ranchers pay a lot of property tax for the counties, and many rural counties, that's the tax base. And a lot of counties, like in Utah, 98% of the land is federal, so they haven't got a big tax base. So it's very important that these AUMs remain viable.
So when a ranch that may have been on a deeded property for 3 or 4 or 6 generations, when the AUMs on the adjoining federal land are diminished in some way, it actually reduces the property value of the underlying deeded land. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Just to follow on, so just to be really clear, if the AUMs on the federal lease are diminished, have you seen that in practice, and what is the effect on the underlying deeded?
Well, generally the effect is, well, then you've got to use some of your private property to carry it, so you have a lot less carrying capacity. So your value is less, your income is less, and sometimes if it cuts too much, the ranch is no longer viable.
Okay. Mr. Helly, how long has your family ranched sheep in the area where you currently do so?
My family immigrated from Austria into right after the turn of the century, and started into livestock grazing before there was even a forest.
The turn of last century.
Yeah.
So,
over 100 years.
Okay. And if you were no longer able to graze your sheep on the federal land, on the neighboring federal allotments, how would that affect the value of your ranch and your operation?
Well, that's an interesting thing because I live in southwest Montana. And the agricultural value of our operation would be greatly reduced. It would become to the point where my family could not make a viable living on the operation with it, were it not for our federal grazing permits. So that would put an undue, risk of our private lands becoming necessarily, open to the market for subdivision or trophy ranches or some of these other things that are not necessarily conducive to what we value in southwest Montana as far as protecting that open space and those wildlife corridors and all that we enjoy about that. So, I'd like to say that it kind of goes both directions. The federal grazing leases, yes, they give us the agricultural opportunity to make our ranches more valuable and keep us in agriculture. So that's a public benefit that the public receives by, almost a semi-conservation easement of those private lands that are intermingled within the public lands.
And as I understand it, because the regulations require adjacent base property, these grazing allotments typically transfer with the deed of the home ranch.
Yeah, correct. You have to, there's some laws and regulations around the transfer, but you can either sell the base property or the livestock in certain instances that are connected to that permit.
And the ultimately the price that someone might pay for that home place is in part affected by what grazing allotments are available. And diminishing the AUMs on the federal land diminishes the value of the home place.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
On an agricultural basis.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I'll recognize the ranking member for her questions.
Thank you. Mr. Wheeler, you were talking about the effect that the commingling has on the bighorn sheep. Can you give us some more examples of how commercial sheep grazing on federal lands have affected the population?
Thank you for the question. Looking at the sheep themselves, or the bighorn sheep, the outdoor industry, if you talk numbers, they're $850 billion a year economic driver, and that supports over 7.5 million jobs in this country. But, when they start, these boundaries start coming into this habitat, this suitable habitat that for the bighorn sheep, and when they commingle, then the reduction of the herds in say the Hell's Canyon area has been reduced, and we have jet boat excursions, and every one of those. I can say maybe the majority of those trips that go up the Hell's Canyon, up the Snake River, all have bighorn sheep on their advertisements. I don't believe they have domestic sheep, but they do have the bighorn sheep going up there, and those are being reduced. And just the importance of the bighorn sheep as far as the petroglyphs that are thousands and thousands of years old. Our past tribal members have depicted bighorn sheep on there, and the book Yellow Wolf: His Own Story, he talks about the bighorn sheep and being able to hunt those. And I just think that when these boundaries are set, we're not against grazing on federal lands, but we are against when they're affecting the habitat of wildlife that is reserved by us in our resource. And
do you know if there are other indigenous cultures who are similarly affected as yours? Maybe not with bighorn sheep, but with others in federal grazing or federal land areas?
Yes, there's our sister tribes, the Umatilla tribe, the Yakima Nation, the Warm Springs tribe, the Upper Snake River tribes. There's the Shoshone Paiutes, the Shoshone Bannocks, the CSKT tribe are all within this area, are near us, that all have had bighorn sheep populations depleted.
And do you know of depletion of other things other than bighorn sheep And, or do you know of, or any of you gentlemen who are testifying, know of instances where the cultural viability and cultural issues such as, or livelihood of tribes have been successfully worked out with commercial grazing or with other domestic grazing activity?
I could say to one of those is the bison that have that issue. The moose in our area now have declined. You know, there's probably numerous reasons, but specifically to the bighorn sheep is the domestic sheep and the pneumonia and the pathogens that are carried by them when they intermingle. So the boundaries, I believe, are the important issue with being able to come to some type of agreement to, you know, like I had mentioned, we're not against grazing, but we are against that affecting the suitable habitat of the bighorn sheep.
So your concern is with the increasing grazing area, or grazing that goes outside of the treaty agreement?
Yes.
And could you explain to the subcommittee how the treaty rights could be affected by increasing grazing in federal lands?
Yes, thank you for the question again. So if you look back at the reserved rights of a treaty with us is 12 Stat 957, and in that treaty with the United States, there was rights reserved to hunt, to fish, to gather in all usual and accustomed areas. And that was part of our sustenance, that we could gather our foods, and we could also, it was also tied to our sacred economic security that we had as far as the value of what this resource meant to us, as far as trade to other tribes and trade throughout the region. A lot of the different materials that were traded were secured in that treaty as well. So then the treaty, which was in 1855, then was ratified in 1858 or 1859, and then the U.S. Constitution, which is Article 6, Clause 3, which is I mentioned the supremacy law, that all treaties are the supreme law of the land, that those rights were reserved in that, and if those depletion of those herds and those depletion of those resources are affected, then our treaty is affected by the depletion of those resources.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Helly, your operation has been involved in a number of lawsuits. Do you feel that the fear of future litigation is something that hangs over you and other ranchers in your area?
Well, definitely. I worry that other people might be, you know, looking at the sheep industry and we need people to come into the sheep industry. But the risk of these lawsuits hanging over our industry is definitely changing people's perspective on the ability to increase and expand our industry. The lamb industry in America, we import over half of what the domestic consumption is. Wool is critical for our military, and we import a lot of wool too. And we're seeing, you know, really good prices for wool right now. The lamb market's good. So the opportunities in the sheep industry are great from an economic perspective, but from, you know, the litigation side of things and you know, a lot of the Western domestic sheep production has been dependent on some public lands grazing. So we're putting at risk you know, an infrastructure and everything else that would hold that industry together to, you know, draw that in. So I mean, economically it looks good, but litigation-wise, that.
So not knowing when the litigation is coming or from which direction really adds uncertainty to you're able to plan your business.
Definitely.
Yeah.
You know, I think that our federal agencies, land management agencies, make a lot of decisions based on the fear of a litigant coming in, rather than on sound management.
Mr. Ellison, have you heard from other ranchers around the country who are concerned about their allotments or permits facing litigation?
Oh, sure, and I've experienced it too. A lot of times these radical environment groups that file these lawsuits really intimidate the local forest and BLM because it brings on so much more work and fear of their water. In 1982, we had a big fire in one of our allotments. They come in and reseeded it, so it carried a lot more. So the BLM gave us what they call temporary non-renewables. And they wouldn't give us anything permanent, but they gave us, but we had to file on these every year. So for 25 years, we went on being able to use these temporary non-renewables. Western Watershed Project, one of these radical environmentalist groups, sent a letter to the BLM saying they was going to sue the BLM if they continue to let us run on this temporary non-renewables. We immediately got a cancellation of our temporary non-renewables. We had to stop it right then. We eventually went to court and we were able to get those back, but that's a lot of times. A lot of times the BLM and serfs will do things so they don't upset the cart.
So you had a longer-term grazing allotment agreement, and it went to this temporary non-renewable,
yes.
Which basically means
you had to renew them every year.
It seems like it's a hand-to-mouth experience.
Yeah.
You have very little certainty about the future.
Exactly.
And it makes it hard to plan. Being a business guy, it makes it hard to plan, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. Mr. Horngren, you proposed legislation clarifying that, quote, annual operating instructions, end quote, should not be considered final agency actions. Under the current system that allows legal challenges to annual operating instructions, is there a potential for agencies to have to litigate similar issues repeatedly?
Yes, there is, Mr. Chairman, and that litigation can occur on the same forest or spread out among forests throughout the West. For example, right now, the Western Resources Legal Center is helping defend as co-defendants lawsuits against the Forest Service on the Fremont-Wainema Forest in Oregon. We had 2 of those lawsuits, which recently were completed in the last year on the Stanislaus National Forest in California and on BLM lands in Arizona. Some of those same issues are brought up again and again.
And how would the changes you propose regarding annual operating instructions benefit both permittees and federal agencies?
It would make the federal agency job a lot easier and less expensive. And it's not trying to do an end run around litigation or shut anybody off from litigation. It's just acknowledging that the big decisions are made in the permit for the 10-year period. You get your shot there. Often you can win, maybe you lose. But once that opportunity is done, implementation of that decision on a year-to-year basis shouldn't continually be subject to litigation.
So that would allow all participants to have their voice.
Yes.
It gets sorted out in a collaborative way, but then gives the rancher certainty for 10 years before the individual decisions can be challenged.
That's right.
Okay, thank you. One last question, if I could. Mr. Horngren, do you believe that the current grazing permit administration process grants ranchers adequate level of certainty for their operation and allows long-term planning?
No, it's difficult, particularly with the Endangered Species Act and the way that's set up now, about the consultation that I mentioned. And the permit process is very uncertain because you don't know what another agency, Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service, is going to shove down the throat of the Forest Service or BLM in the name of protecting the fish and wildlife.
Okay, thank you. Does the ranking member have additional questions? No. Okay. I would like to touch on a couple. I'll recognize myself for one more round of questions, and we'll wrap up our discussion today. A report by the Congressional Research Service based on data from the Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service states that in the fiscal year 2016, out of the 12 million animal unit months that could have been authorized for use on BLM land, only about 8,700,000 were actually used. In the same year on Forest Service land, only 6,800,000 head months were used out of 8,200,000 that were available that could have been authorized. Mr. Ellison, do you believe that the accounts do you believe accounts for the non-use of millions of animal unit months? What do you believe accounts for these non-use of the animal unit months?
Well, there's several reasons. There are a lot of, especially certain areas, there's a lot of what we call vacant allotments. And sometimes they want to transfer them to sheep, from sheep to cattle, or vice versa, or they want to make some changes. Right now, the real problem is getting the NEPA done on those in order to get these allotments back into use. Sometimes some of these allotments, it's a hard, rugged country that you don't want to. But generally, what's been really causing a problem lately is being able to get the NEPA done on these vacant allotments. One of the big challenges that's on the bottom list of getting the NEPA. And as we know, there's a huge backlog getting NEPA done. And so with the vacant allotments, they're probably not going to get done. I know a lot of those allotments are just waiting for the NEPA to get done so they get them back into use.
So streamlining the NEPA process
That's
would be
right.
a benefit. Okay. Could you explain the concept of voluntary non-use for those who may not be familiar with the term?
Yeah, voluntary non-use is just, whether it's, maybe it's a really dry year or financially hard times come upon it. And so sometimes you have to take temporary non-renewables.
That's to be
Or not temporary, but just,
to be a good steward of the land.
Yeah, a lot of times it's for the benefit of the ground. And so we don't graze it. And other times, like I say, sometimes it's financial reasons. Usually on the Forest Service, they allow you 3 years. BLM, sometimes you can go on for a long time. But generally speaking, a lot of times they're not being used because of the health of the resource.
Yeah. Mr. Helly, are you aware of any ranchers who have had animal unit months reduced or been threatened with a reduction, or have you experienced it yourself?
Thank you, Mr. Gianforte, for that question, because recently an episode had occurred up in our Upper Ruby where there was some maintenance done on a project that required some road building in that. So it happened that it was in a roadless area, and when that forest found out about it, the ranger, I guess it was authorized by the recreation person and maybe the range conservationist, but when the forest ranger got word from a bystander or somebody that saw it, then things were just kind of fell out of place at that point. And then I think they threatened to, not let the cattle go into that, and if they would go into that area, that they would threaten them with a reduction in their AUMs. When all that was thought to have been prearranged and worked out, and it was just a lack of communication, I think, that had that. But that's what happens when you don't involve the permittees and when you're making decisions and stuff. So it was unfortunate that they were threatened with reductions.
For Mr. Helly and Mr. Ellison, have you ever seen situations where voluntary non-use has not been voluntary?
Yeah, a good example of that is the national monuments. When these places that range are made into national monuments, the rules and regulations become so severe and so hard that it's just not worth it. So a lot of times that causes a vacant allotment. But a lot of times it's because of the welfare of the range.
Okay, Mr. Helly?
It's hard to say because I've seen a lot of sheep ranchers just go out of business. So I don't know what the underlying things were or if there was some offer or something. But I know in Beaverhead County there was lots of sheep run on forest land, and there's very few of them now.
Okay. Well, I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony today. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks for any member to submit a written opening statement or questions for the record. If there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.